Hey, 42 here. In the year 1519, the Aztecs ruled one of the largest and most powerful empires on planet Earth, home to some 6 million people and spanning more than 800,000 square miles of Mesoamerica. The Aztecs were a dominant military force with a rich culture and a proud history. The empire's capital, Tenochtitlan, was amongst the 3 largest cities on Earth, and its emperor, Moctezuma II, was a wise and intelligent leader. But fast forward just 2.5 years, and somehow, this most mighty of empires had been utterly defeated. The sheer speed of this demise is nothing short of stunning. But even more remarkable is how that demise came about. Because the great and powerful Aztecs weren't toppled by a vast invading army or obliterated in an apocalypse-class natural disaster. No. They were completely and utterly defeated by just 500 men. And not just any men. Their conquerors were a ragtag group of Spanish mutineers who didn't even have permission to be there in the first place. Now I know what you're thinking, how the hell did 500 fugitives conquer an empire of 6 million souls in just 2.5 years? Well, pour yourself a steaming mug of chocolat and prepare the nearest human for ritual sacrifice, because this is a story of politics, pestilence, puppet kings and polyglots. This is the story of the fall of the Aztec Empire. Did you know that having a job you don't enjoy or you find stressful negatively affects your physical health? This 2021 research paper found that stress spills out from the workplace and reduces quality of life and life expectancy. But what if you could work from anywhere, increase your income, and travel more while still earning? Well, you can make all of that a reality with Triple 10. Triple 10 offers flexible, beginner-friendly online boot camps with one of the highest graduation and employment rates in the industry. It's the only boot camp in the US that provides unlimited externship opportunities even after graduation. They give students projects with real companies for work experience. 87% of Triple 10 grads get hired in 6 months or less, and if you don't get a job within 6 months, you'll get a full refund. I highly recommend the data science course, because Python is such a fun language to learn, and with the AI industry booming right now, it's sure to land you a top career after you graduate. But if you're unsure of your career direction, try taking the free career consultation with the Triple 10 advisor. It's a great opportunity to talk with a professional about your future career. Improve your career using my code 42 for 30% off on all their programs. And click the link in my description or scan the QR code for a free career consultation. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Spanish were busy exploring, colonizing, the various islands of the Caribbean, including Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. But before long, rumors began to trickle in from Spanish sailors of a large, unexplored landmass to the west. At first, the Spanish suspected this lump of land was just another large island in the Caribbean. But after a couple of tentative expeditions, sponsored by the newly installed Spanish governor of Cuba, a man called Diego Velázquez, it became clear that this was no island. It was a brand new continent, North America. A shiny new continent to explore, colonize, was exciting news. But even more encouraging were reports that the natives of this brave new world possessed large quantities of the one thing the Spanish valued above all else: sleep. Gold. By 1519, Governor Velázquez had decided it was high time he figured out where all that gold was coming from, and so he put together a third, significantly larger expedition to further explore the mainland. He hired his brother-in-law to lead the mission, a man by the name of Hernán Cortés, known to his mates as Big Hearn, probably. Cortés was a Spaniard, but he'd lived in the Caribbean for most of his adult life, and he had been heavily involved in the Spanish conquest of Hispaniola. On paper, he was the perfect candidate for the job. He was experienced, charismatic, and capable. But for all his virtues, Cortés was an extremely ambitious man, and several of Velázquez's closest allies were concerned that he couldn't be trusted. And it turns out they were absolutely right, because Cortés had no intention of letting Velázquez take all the glory for delivering the Americas to the Spanish crown. No, he planned to go rogue and claim that glory for himself. Recognizing the danger, Velázquez stripped Cortés of the expedition's command. But it was already too late. One of Cortés's men had tipped him off that Velázquez was wavering. And rather than stick around waiting to be given his marching orders, Cortés had gathered his men and he set sail. In the eyes of the Spanish law, they were now officially mutineers. It was a risky move. The next time he set foot on Spanish soil, Cortés would be tried and almost certainly imprisoned. But he reasoned that if he was able to claim enough new territory for the Spanish crown, and more importantly shitloads of gold, his crimes would almost certainly be forgiven. The rogue expedition sailed for the island of Cozumel just off the coast of the mainland, which at the time was ruled by those other Mesopotamian A-listers, the Maya. The Spanish had already established a presence on Cozumel and had good relations with the locals, so the island represented a good spot to resupply before pushing on into the unknown. But while stationed on Cozumel, Cortés heard a strange rumor. According to the Maya, there were already a couple of white men living on the mainland in what is now known as the Yucatan Peninsula. After a bit of investigation and a reconnaissance mission or two, Cortés was able to track these men down. They turned out to be Spanish sailors, the sole survivors of a shipwreck some 8 years earlier. During those 8 years, the men had lived alongside the Maya, learning their ways and, most importantly, their language. Cortés offered both a place in his crew on the spot. One refused. He had a Mayan wife and 3 kids, and had very much gone native. But the other man, a Franciscan friar by the name of Geronimo de Aguila, agreed. Cortés didn't know it at the time, but he just secured 1/2 of a linguistic key that would ultimately unlock the secret to the conquest of the Aztec Empire. After leaving Cozumel, Cortés began exploring the coast of what is now Mexico, landing every so often to resupply or look for gold. Like Cozumel, this was Maya territory, but unlike Cozumel, the locals had little to no contact with the Spanish, and more often than not, they responded to their incursions by attacking them. After landing near the Mayan city of Potochan, Cortés fought and beat the local Maya in a couple of pitched battles. Recognizing they were outmatched by the Spanish, the Maya sued for peace, offering a series of gifts to sweeten the deal, including food, gold, and 20 slaves. Being the good Spanish conquistador that he was, Cortés was only really bothered about the gold. Or at least he was, until he realized that the true treasure was hidden amongst those 20 slaves. Because that's where he found a young girl with a gift for languages. Her birth name has been lost to history, but shortly after finding her, Cortés had baptized her under the name of Marina. Marina, who's also sometimes known as La Mincha, had possibly been captured by the Maya, or possibly sold to them as a slave when she was just a child. Now around 20 years old, she spoke their language fluently. But here's the important part. Her native tongue was Nahuatl, the lingua franca of the Aztecs. It's no exaggeration to say that had Cortés not stumbled across both Geronimo de Aguila and Marina in the first few weeks of his expedition, the Spanish might never have conquered the Aztec Empire, and the entire history of the Americas might have played out completely differently. At first that might sound like a bit of a stretch, but to understand why these twin discoveries were so important, we first have to understand a little bit more about the Aztecs. The Aztec Empire was formed when 3 powerful city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, joined forces to gain control of what today is central Mexico. Between them, these city-states were known as the Triple Alliance, but over time, Tenochtitlan grew to be the dominant force amongst the 3, eventually becoming the seat of power of the growing empire. The Aztecs followed a rather different empire-building playbook to the majority of their European counterparts. When they conquered new cities and territories, they didn't make any attempt to actually govern them, and they didn't replace the local rulers with Aztec ones either. In fact, they didn't really do anything. They left things entirely as they were, except for one thing. They forced their defeated foes to pay tribute. It was essentially the world's largest mafia extortion racket. So long as the conquered leaders paid their taxes and supplied the Aztecs with a few warriors from time to time, they were left in peace. But if the tribute payments stopped flowing for whatever reason, the Aztecs would send in the Eagle warriors to break a few kneecaps. On paper, the system worked well, but there was one fatal flaw. Almost without exception, the subjects of the Aztec Empire absolutely hated their rulers. I mean, nobody wants to be forced to partake in a Mafia Aztec extortion racket, do they? When Cortez landed on the North American mainland, he had around 500 men and a dozen or so horses at his disposal. It's true that the Spanish military technology was some way ahead of the Aztecs, who hadn't yet discovered iron or steel, and they'd never seen anything like the Spaniards' small supply of guns and cannons. But even so, Cortez's expedition should have posed no threat whatsoever to Aztec rule. It was simply far too small. You could have dropped 500 modern soldiers armed with AK-47s into Aztec territory in 1519, and they would have stood literally no chance of defeating an empire of 6 million people. Sooner or later, you're going to run out of bullets, and then you're just a man wielding an extremely over-engineered metal club. No. Cortez could only hope to conquer the Aztecs if he first divided them. Luckily for him, they were already pretty bloody divided to begin with, but the only way for him to actually know that was to first talk to them. And that's where Marina and Father Aguila came in, because through them, Cortez had stumbled upon a method to communicate directly with the Aztecs. He would speak to Father Aguila in Spanish, Father Aguila would translate the message into Yucatec Maya for Marina, and Marina would then translate that into the dominant Aztec language, Nahuatl. Okay, so it was a little bit clunky, but it worked, and things got a lot easier when Marina learned Spanish, effectively becoming the Aztecs' answer to C-3PO, a walking translation machine. Unsurprisingly, Marina quickly became absolutely crucial to Cortez's plans, and the two grew close. So close that despite already being married, Cortez named her as his consort, and a few years later, they had a child together. His name was Martin Cortez, and he is considered to have been one of the first individuals of mixed European and Mesoamerican descent in history. Anyway, Cortez and his men were soon back aboard their ships exploring the Mexican coast, landing occasionally to look for gold and speak to, or fight with, the locals. And it was during one of those landings, sometime in April 1519, that the Spaniards were surprised to find a welcoming party waiting for them on the beach. A welcoming party not of Maya, but Aztecs. It turned out that the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma II, had been following Cortez's progress with great interest, and apparently he decided it was time to make contact with these strange white men from across the sea. Of all the things Cortez might have expected from his first meeting with the Aztecs, this probably wasn't it. Even at this early stage, he was already well aware of their fearsome reputation. War was in the Aztecs' blood, a huge part of their cultural identity. And yet, at the first meeting, there were no warriors or weapons, only amiable ambassadors bearing extravagant gifts. And it was those gifts that immediately caught Cortez's eye, because some of them were made of solid gold. Moctezuma had presumably planned this warm welcome as a way of getting the Spaniards on his side, but in reality it had almost the exact opposite effect. Hernan Cortez had come to the mainland in search of gold for the Spanish crown, and his very first meeting with the Aztecs proved that they had it in abundance. After the formal introductions were over, Cortez wasted no time whatsoever in founding a new settlement in the name of Spain. Apparently, he wasn't overly interested in the fact that they were already Aztec lands. He was now so confident that he would soon be filling his pockets with gold that he named the settlement La Villarica de la Vera Cruz, or in English, the rich village of the True Cross. Incidentally, this settlement is still there to this day, now simply called Veracruz, and it's home to the most important port in Mexico, along with almost 500,000 people. With the founding of Veracruz, Cortez had made a solid base from which to explore the surrounding area. And soon enough, his scouts discovered a nearby city-state by the name of Zempoala. It turned out to be a major settlement of the indigenous Teutonic people, and to Cortez's delight, they welcomed him and his men into their city with open arms. Through the linguistic efforts of Marina and Friar Aguila, it soon became clear why. The citizens of Zempoala were living under the Aztec yoke, and paying a heavy price for that privilege. It was music to Cortez's ears, and he had no trouble whatsoever convincing the Teutonic chieftains to rebel against their Aztec overlords. Within a matter of days, the Spanish had gained their first key ally in Aztec territory. The Teutonic chiefs promptly arrested all Aztec tax collectors in the city, then pledged to supply Cortez with several hundred warriors. They even went so far as to provide free labor to speed up the building work at Veracruz. In other words, it was all surprisingly chummy. But it wasn't long before Emperor Moctezuma got wind of what was going on. He clearly needed to act fast against the Spanish, and so he sent a few thousand bloodthirsty eagle warriors to crush them utterly before they became a genuine threat. Or at least that's probably what he should have done. But instead of sending an army to Zempoala, Moctezuma sent more expensive gifts. Okay, so at first that might sound like a bit of an odd move, an inexplicable show of weakness in the face of an obvious threat. But in reality, this measured response was actually a fairly shrewd piece of diplomacy. You see, Moctezuma wasn't in the least bit afraid of the Teutonic rebellion. Rebellion was a part of everyday life for the Aztecs. Their method of rule practically guaranteed it. When rebellions inevitably broke out, the Aztecs crushed them. That's how it worked. As for Cortez, Moctezuma wasn't afraid of him either. But he was afraid, or at least wary, of the country Cortez represented. And that made perfect sense, because Spain was a completely unknown quantity. From Moctezuma's perspective, the arrival of the Spanish must have felt a bit like how an alien invasion would feel today. He had no way of knowing just how much of a threat this distant empire might be. And what he did know, namely that they were in possession of military technology his people couldn't match, was worrying. Put simply, it was a smart move to be cautious rather than risk starting a war with an enemy he didn't understand. Up until this point, things were going rather swimmingly for Cortez and his men. So swimmingly, in fact, that it's easy to forget they were still technically fugitives from Spanish law. And whilst Cortez was apparently fairly comfortable with his status as a wanted criminal, it seems that not all of his men felt the same way. Not that you can really blame them. To say that Cortez was playing with fire would be the understatement of the 16th century. He was attempting to manipulate the complex politics of a people he didn't really understand, whilst monumentally outnumbered in potentially hostile territory. If something went wrong, even a bit wrong, he and all of his men would be dead in a matter of hours. And it wasn't just the locals he had to worry about. As mutineers, Cortez and his men were risking imprisonment or even death the moment they stepped foot on Spanish soil. Cortez was banking on ultimately being forgiven for betraying Velasquez by delivering a shit ton of gold to the Spanish crown, but there was no guarantees that plan would actually work. And so a small subset of Cortez's men began secretly plotting to betray him by stealing his ships and making a break for Cuba to report to Velasquez. It was Cortez's worst nightmare, a mutiny within a mutiny. A mutiny inception. Luckily for him, somewhere along the line, the mutineers trusted the wrong person, and their cover was blown. On hearing that a bunch of his men were planning to betray him, Cortez went full Moctezuma and gave everyone on his crew a really thoughtful gift in an attempt to win them back over. Just kidding. He ordered that several of the plotters be beaten, whipped, and in one case mutilated. Then he rounded up all the ringleaders and had them all hanged. Oh, and just to be sure nobody else got any bright ideas about betraying the original mutiny, Cortez took the rather drastic measure of ordering that his own ships be sunk, literally stranding the whole crew on the mainland. Whether they liked it or not, there was no going back. With his expedition secured, for now, Cortez set his sights on the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, and a meeting with Moctezuma himself. From Zempoala, he marched his men to the Confederacy of Tlaxcala, a kind of loose coalition of about 200 towns, which despite being surrounded on all sides by Aztec territory, weren't actually under Aztec rule. If the Totonacs hated the Aztecs, the Tlaxcalans positively despised them. The two factions had been engaged in a century-long ritual conflict known as a Flower War, and the animosity between them went generations deep. Knowing all of this from his Teutonic allies, Cortez was probably fairly confident of picking up another key ally for his upcoming showdown with Moctezuma. If so, he was about to be severely disappointed, because no sooner had he stepped foot in Tlaxcalan territory, his men were attacked. The following 3 days played host to a series of increasingly bloody skirmishes, and Cortez would almost certainly have been utterly defeated if he had not come up with a cunning plan. In many ways, his battle with the Tlaxcalans was similar to his wider attempt at defeating the Aztecs, only in miniature. Hopelessly outnumbered, he had no chance of winning by force. His only hope was to talk his way out of trouble. Of course, talking is rather difficult when several thousand men armed with obsidian-spiked baseball bats are trying to murder you. In the end, Cortez made a desperate play. When his men engaged the enemy, he instructed them not to strike killing blows, and instead to take prisoners wherever possible. Then, with the help of Friar Aguila and Marina, he explained to the prisoners that he wanted to help their people defeat the Aztecs once and for all. He then simply let them go, hoping they would pass the message on when they made it back home. Luckily for him, the plan worked. All of a sudden, the Tlaxcalans abruptly stopped attacking, and Cortez and his men were welcomed into the Tlaxcalan capital, Tlaxcala. Seriously, these names. The Spanish stayed there for almost 3 weeks, recovering from their many wounds and negotiating with the 4 Tlaxcalan chiefs. Hernan Cortez lived over half a millennium ago, so it's hard to make definitive statements about his character, but one thing seems fairly clear. The man knew how to get people on his side. Whether it was charisma, his intimidating character, or a really fancy aftershave, he just seemed to have had a knack for winning allies to his cause. By the time he left Tlaxcala, he had coaxed the city's chiefs into providing him with more than 1,000 warriors, convinced many important Tlaxcalan nobles to be baptized in the name of the Catholic Church, and arranged several marriages between Tlaxcalan princesses and his most trusted lieutenants. Just to reiterate, all of that happened in 3 weeks. By way of a honeymoon for the rather unexpected newlyweds, Cortez marched his ever-growing army to the nearby holy city of Cholula, which was firmly under Aztec control. Up until this point, Moctezuma had showed nothing but respect to the roaming band of Spaniards who turned up in his kingdom, but their arrival in Cholula marked a noticeable change in that attitude. The holy city was just 15 miles or so from the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, and it seems Moctezuma was starting to get a little nervous. True, his armies greatly outnumbered Cortez's, but with every passing week, the Spanish conquistador seems to be gaining more allies. Allies who were, without exception, distinctly hostile to Moctezuma's rule. When Cortez and his men arrived at Cholula, they weren't greeted with smiles and gifts. In fact, they weren't really greeted at all. Instead, they spent a tense and uneasy few days in the city before things ultimately came to a head, when Cortez's favorite consort / trusty translation droid came to him with worrying news. She claimed to have struck up a conversation with a local woman, the wife of a Cholula nobleman, who'd informed her that Moctezuma had ordered the Cholulan chiefs to stop the Spanish advance at all costs. Being a holy city, Cholula had a relatively small military presence by Aztec standards, so a full-scale assault on the Spanish wasn't possible. Instead, at least according to the informant, the city's chiefs planned to wait until nightfall, then murder the Spanish in their sleep. Every last one of them. As you can probably imagine, Cortez didn't wait around to have his throat slit in his sleep. No, he went on the attack, capturing and killing hundreds of Cholulan citizens before torching the city down. According to his own correspondence, Cortez and his men killed a staggering 3,000 people in just 3 hours. That's a cold-blooded murder every 3.5 seconds or so. For obvious reasons, the events of that day, 500 years ago, are now known as the Cholula Massacre. Believe it or not, at this point in his campaign, Cortez still hadn't really decided on whether or not he was going to try and conquer the entire Aztec Empire. He still didn't really have the numbers, and he likely believed there was plenty of gold and territory to be had without declaring all-out war. But the Cholula Massacre was an obvious step in a very dangerous direction. From that point on, there was only ever really going to be one conclusion. too much blood had been spilt for those in charge to sit down and talk about trade agreements. With Moctezuma's Cholula plot foiled, Cortez and his men were ready to make their final push towards the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. And they arrived there on the 8th of November, 1519, less than a month after the brutal slaughter at Cholula. Since landing on this strange new continent, the Spanish conquistadors had seen many strange and amazing sights, unlike anything from back home. But nothing they had witnessed up until that point could have prepared them for Tenochtitlan. It must have truly felt like stepping into another world. And if Cortez and his men retained any notion that the locals were somehow backwards or primitive, entering the Aztec capital would surely have dispelled that myth completely. Because Tenochtitlan was, quite simply, one of the most remarkable cities ever built by the hands of man. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, it was truly a marvel of civil engineering, accessible by way of 3 giant man-made causeways and many small bridges. It was home to as many as 300,000 people. That may not be all that impressive by modern standards, but in the early 16th century, it made Tenochtitlan one of the biggest cities on Earth. For reference, London housed just 50,000 people at the time. Tenochtitlan's mighty populace needed plenty of space, so the Aztecs expanded the city by building huge artificial islands around the natural one. This sprawling settlement spanned 20 distinct districts, centered on a central square surrounded by palaces and temples, with man-made canals providing both transport and irrigation. The entire city was fed by twin terracotta aqueducts, each over 2.5 miles long. Most people assume that Mesoamerican cultures lagged far behind their European counterparts in terms of technology when the Spanish first arrived, and that was indeed true in some respects. But there were just as many areas where the Aztecs were superior. The Spanish may have trumped them for military technology, for example, but they couldn't match the Aztecs for civil engineering. Something the marvel that was Tenochtitlan proved emphatically. If Cortez was slightly worried about how he might be received in the Aztec capital, having just murdered 3,000 people in one of the empire's most important holy cities, it turned out he needn't have been. Because when he arrived at Tenochtitlan, the Aztec emperor himself was waiting on the city's largest and most impressive causeway, resplendent in his finest garments and decked out in more bling than Jay-Z on payday. Moctezuma greeted his foreign guests with a grand and flowery speech, welcoming them to the seat of the Aztec Empire and offering them yet more gold-encrusted gifts. Not wanting to be outdone, Cortez responded with a flowery speech of his own, explaining how he'd been sent across this vast and empty ocean at the behest of Joanna of Castile, Queen of Spain, and the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, which was obviously complete bullshit. But hey, it sounded good. With the pompous pleasantries successfully traded, Moctezuma invited Cortez and his men into his City of Wonders. And here's where history starts to get a little hazy. It seems the Spanish were granted their own dedicated compound in the city, but at some point, sources are divided as to exactly when, Cortez somehow managed to capture Moctezuma inside his own city and place him under house arrest. How exactly this happened is one of the great mysteries of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, but it was to prove pivotal in the events that followed. Moctezuma wasn't exactly under lock and key, at least to some extent he was allowed to go about his duties as normal. But thanks to Cortez's machinations and a little help from Marina, the Aztec emperor became little more than a puppet, a mouthpiece through which the Spanish could control the masses. Now, sort of in control of Tenochtitlan, Cortez began sending out scouts to look for gold in the surrounding regions. But a few months later, he received word that an army had attacked his allies in Zempoala. The first signs of an Aztec counterattack against a Spanish incursion, perhaps? Actually, no. In fact, these soldiers weren't Aztec at all. They were Spanish. It turned out that back in Cuba, Velázquez had decided he wasn't going to take Cortez's mutiny lying down. Once he'd realized he'd been betrayed, he started putting together a second, significantly larger force to arrest, or if necessary, kill Cortez and his fellow mutineers. Led by seasoned conquistador Panfilo de Narvaez, the new Spanish army was about twice the size of Cortez's, with significantly more cavalry, guns, and cannon. In other words, it was seriously bad news, and not even an Aztec translation droid was going to help Cortez talk his way out of trouble this time. With the stability of his situation in Tenochtitlan still fragile, Cortez decided the best course of action was to take the fight to Narvaez before things spiraled out of control. And so he left one of his lieutenants in charge of Tenochtitlan and marched for the coast with around 250 of his best men and 200 Aztec allies. That left Cortez outnumbered about 2-1, the kind of odds that would typically have resulted in certain defeat. But the wily Spanish conquistador had a trick up his frilled Spanish sleeve. By this point, he'd been on the North American mainland for about a year. Whilst not exactly an expert, he knew the country well, and his native allies knew it better than anyone. Narvaez, on the other hand, was stepping foot into what is now Mexico for the very first time, and he had no experience whatsoever facing the Aztecs. Cortez made full use of this pronounced experience gap. With the help of his allies, he managed to locate Narvaez's army at Zempoala undetected. He then gathered his forces and launched a surprise attack in the middle of the night under the cover of heavy rainfall. The plan came off perfectly. Cortez targeted the gunpowder weapons and horses first, taking them out of the fight before Narvaez could rouse and organize his men. The sudden and entirely unexpected attack caused absolute chaos amongst the new Spanish force, and despite the weight of numbers against him, Cortez won with ease, losing just 2 of his men in the fight. In the end, and somewhat ironically, Velázquez's attempts to bring Cortez to justice had almost a complete opposite effect. After hearing about the riches Cortez had already secured from the Aztecs, almost all of Narvaez's men defected to the force they'd been sent to destroy. For the loss of just 2 lives, Cortez gained several hundred new troops, dozens of horses, and a brand new arsenal of guns and cannon. Many Spanish songs of celebration were sung that night, probably, but the party mood didn't last long. With Narvaez defeated, Cortez marched his men straight back to Tenochtitlan, where they found the city in a state of utter chaos. Somehow, in the space of just 2 months, Spanish control of the capital had been lost entirely. The puppet emperor, Moctezuma, had been replaced with a new leader, and the Spanish compound was the subject of sporadic attacks from really angry Aztecs. In other words, whilst Cortez was away, something had gone really seriously very wrong. In hindsight, that something was probably inevitable. When Cortez left to fight Narvaez, he'd taken his best men with him for the upcoming fight, leaving behind just a skeleton force to look after the city and keep an eye on Moctezuma. But the problem with taking your best men with you is that you have to leave the worst ones behind. In charge of this merry band of idiots was a man called Pedro de Alvarado. He was an experienced conquistador and capable fighter, but also a renowned hothead with a thirst for gold and a famously low opinion of the natives. Under the right command, Alvarado was a useful asset, something he'd proved many times over the years. But left to his own devices, well, he almost single-handedly destroyed everything Cortez had been working for. The trouble started during a feast in honor of the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca. The party took place in Tenochtitlan's main temple, and the guests were a selection of the city's most important people. As you would expect, they came dressed in their Sunday best, and, being Aztecs, that included a hell of a lot of gold. Exactly what happened that night is a subject of some debate. According to Aztec accounts, Alvarado was driven into a kind of murderous frenzy at the sight of so much bling. The Spanish, on the other hand, claim that Alvarado got wind of an Aztec plot to attack the Spanish garrison once the feast was over. But whilst the why of the thing isn't entirely clear, the what most certainly is. Alvarado ordered his men to block off the temple's exits, then attacked the partygoers without warning. There were close to 1,000 people at that feast, and almost all were unarmed. The result was, predictably, a bloodbath, with hundreds of people brutally slaughtered in a matter of minutes. It was sometime in the aftermath of this attack, today known as the Massacre in the Great Temple, that Cortez returned to Tenochtitlan to find his best laid plans had gone tenok tits up. Having already proven he was a shrewd operator, he wasted no time trying to rectify this sticky situation, forcing Moctezuma to take to the roof of the Spanish compound and ask his countrymen to allow the Spanish to leave the city peacefully. But by this point, the Aztecs were well aware that Moctezuma had been compromised, so instead of doing as he said, they pelted him with stones as a full-blown riot broke out. Moctezuma II, months earlier, the untouchable emperor of the mighty Aztec Empire, was killed in the melee. Spanish accounts of the incident claim it was his own subjects that got him, whilst Aztec records state that, having demonstrated he was no longer of any use as a political pawn, Moctezuma was murdered by the Spanish. Either way, the ex-emperor was dead, and the populace of Tenochtitlan was on the brink of launching an all-out assault on the Spanish garrison. For perhaps the first time, Cortez must have realized just how much of a tightrope he'd been walking all along. He was now stuck in the middle of a hostile city, hopelessly outnumbered and surrounded on all sides by enemies. Staying in the city meant certain death, but getting out was mission impossible. Still, they had to try, and so Cortez gathered his men and ordered them to gather as much of their plundered Aztec gold as they could. Then, perhaps taking inspiration from his attack on Narvaez, he waited for the cover of darkness before making a break for it. Attempting to sneak the entire Spanish garrison, along with some 10,000 of their Aztec allies, out of the city in the middle of night whilst carrying a metric shit ton of gold was always going to be a long shot, and unsurprisingly, they were spotted almost at once. The alarm was raised, and within minutes Aztec warriors were flooding the streets in their thousands. What had started out as a stealthy escape attempt quickly spiraled into one of the wildest and most dramatic retreats in the history of warfare. Cortez and his most trusted lieutenants were on horseback, and they managed to streak out of the city largely unharmed. But for those unfortunate enough to be on foot, i.e. almost everyone, it was a very different story. Tenochtitlan wasn't exactly an ideal city to escape from. The fact that it could only be left by a series of causeways made it patently obvious where the Spanish were headed, which turned out to be the Western Causeway, and the causeway itself acted as an unavoidable bottleneck. The Aztecs attacked from all sides, meeting the Spanish in the streets with clubs at the ready, firing arrows down on them from the rooftops and launching darts and spears from canoes that soon lined the Western Causeway in their hundreds. Some of the Spanish tried to flee into the lake itself to avoid the onslaught, but weighed down as they were by their riches stashed in their pockets, many drowned. If you're starting to think that nobody could possibly have made it out of that city alive, you aren't too far off the money. Estimates vary, but it's thought that as many as 800 Spanish were killed, about 80% of Cortez's force, along with a staggering 4,000 of his native allies. In other words, it was a complete and utter disaster, and it's a minor miracle it didn't immediately spell the end of Cortez's expedition. In truth, it almost certainly would have, were it not for the help of his allies. But somehow, they got away, and after fighting several more rearguard battles against the pursuing Aztecs over the next couple of days, Cortez and what was left of his army limped back to the relative safety of Tlaxcala. Had things played out a little differently, Tenochtitlan, now under the management of Emperor... yeah, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that one. The new Aztec Emperor would probably have sent a large army to Tlaxcala and ended things once and for all. But the course of history can turn on the smallest of things, and the future of what we now call Mexico was ultimately decided by something quite literally microscopic. You see, when Cortez and his men fled Tenochtitlan, they inadvertently left something behind. Something that would prove to be orders of magnitude more deadly than any Spanish army could ever have been. When Panfilo de Narvaez had landed on the Mexican coast in search of Cortez, some of his men had been feeling a little under the weather, suffering the effects of some nasty virus or other. During the ensuing fight with their fellow countrymen, the disease passed to an unknown number of Cortez's men. some of whom would eventually perish during the retreat from Tenochtitlan. As the Aztecs cleared the city of Spanish corpses in the aftermath, the virus passed onto them. And the rest, as they say, is history. Truly horrifying history. The virus turned out to be smallpox. Already extremely dangerous to the Spanish, it proved utterly devastating to the Native Americans, including those far beyond the Aztecs' borders. The history of smallpox can be traced back about 3,000 years, with the first suspected cases appearing on the desiccated bodies of certain Egyptian mummies. During those 3 long millennia, people of the so-called Old World developed some level of natural immunity to this deadly virus. But until 1520, the disease was entirely absent from the New World. The Aztecs had never even heard of it, let alone being exposed to it. And so, when they contracted smallpox from Cortez's men in the autumn of 1520, they were hit with the full terrible might of one of the deadliest diseases ever to stalk mankind. The first wave hit Tenochtitlan not long after the Spanish retreat, killing 50% of the population in under 3 months, including the new emperor whose name I can't pronounce. Unsurprisingly, the Aztecs were left in utter disarray, and with several thousand people dying every single day, hunting down a few battered Spaniards suddenly didn't seem quite so important anymore. Unfortunately for the Aztecs, that gave Cortez the time he needed to regroup, recover, and resupply after the near-catastrophic retreat from the capital. And having failed in his bid to control Tenochtitlan through his own unique brand of balls-to-the-wall diplomacy, he resolved this time to take the city by force instead. After spending 6 months in Tlaxcala rebuilding his strength, Cortez marched on the Aztec capital in the December of 1520. He had around 1,300 Spanish soldiers still with him, along with some 10,000 Tlaxcalans. It was an impressive force, but Cortez was only just getting started. By the time the final showdown came at Tenochtitlan, some months later, he would have somewhere in the region of 200,000 native warriors from various factions fighting alongside him. Cortez started by attacking, and in most cases easily defeating, the small cities that surrounded Lake Texcoco, leaving the Aztec capital completely isolated. But even cut off and alone, Tenochtitlan wasn't an easy city to attack. Its location on the lake and access by causeways made direct assault practically suicidal. And the warriors of the Aztec garrison were masters of the particular kind of warfare fought in and around their unique city. But Tenochtitlan's formidable defensive strength came at a great cost. The city was extremely easy to besiege. And so, rather than commit his entire force to an all-out assault, Cortez began to put the squeeze on. He ordered the building of a small fleet of ships to patrol the lake, and stationed guards on all the causeways, trapping the Aztecs inside the city and cutting them off from key food sources along the shore. He then destroyed the twin aqueducts that brought fresh spring water into the city. You might be wondering why the residents of Tenochtitlan didn't just drink the lake water, but that wasn't actually possible. Lake Texcoco lay in what is known as an endorheic basin, a region where the river system is completely isolated from the ocean. In an endorheic basin, water only leaves the system either through evaporation or by leaching into the ground, a process that causes salt to accumulate, particularly at the basin's lowest point, in this case, Lake Texcoco. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm talking about Lake Texcoco in the past tense here, more on that at the end of the video. And if you don't already know the answer, it's well worth the wait. Anyway, with Tenochtitlan's population decimated by the recent smallpox outbreak, the demand for food and water was significantly lower than normal. But over time, the lack of these key resources started to take a toll all the same, as did the constant bombardment from Spanish cannons and the sporadic attacks launched over land and lake by Cortez and his allies. These assaults were typically short and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But for Cortez, who had a seemingly endless supply of native warriors at his disposal, these losses were far easier to sustain. Still, the stakes were incredibly high on both sides. The Spanish may have had the upper hand in most skirmishes, but those soldiers unfortunate enough to be captured alive were invariably taken to Tenochtitlan's great temple, where they were offered as human sacrifices to the Aztec gods in return for divine aid. But that aid never came, and by August 1521, after 8 months of stubborn resistance, Tenochtitlan was finally weakened. As it became clear that all hopes were lost, another Aztec emperor with a name I still can't pronounce was captured and executed after attempting to flee the city in a canoe. And, sensing his moment, Cortez launched one last assault. On the 13th of August 1521, the last great bastion of the mighty Aztec Empire was defeated. The city had been badly damaged during the long siege, but it was almost entirely obliterated in the aftermath, as buildings were torched and the city's surviving citizens were brutalized. When the carnage was over, Cortez began rebuilding almost at once, laying the foundations for a grand settlement of his own. He named it Mexico City, and today, it's the 5th largest city in the world. Relatively few people realize that this great modern metropolis is built directly on top of the old Aztec capital. Of course, Mexico City is far bigger than Tenochtitlan ever was, with the modern urban area sprawling over the entirety of Lake Texcoco, drained by the Spanish over 400 years ago. As you can probably imagine, an old lake bed isn't exactly the ideal foundation for a modern city. And that particular urban planning decision still causes major issues even today. Subsidence is a huge problem across the city, with ground levels sinking by up to 50 centimeters a year in some places, wreaking havoc on homes and infrastructure. The region is also prone to earthquakes, and with all that loose soil and clay beneath the city, the resultant shaking is amplified dramatically. After the fall of the Aztec Empire, Mexico City became the capital of a brand new country, imaginatively called New Spain. Cortez's mutiny against Velázquez was duly swept under the carpet as he had predicted. But whilst he probably hoped to be put in charge of the new territory he so audaciously acquired, that honour ultimately went to a nobleman named Antonio de Mendoza instead. Apparently, the Spanish crown felt that Cortez couldn't entirely be trusted with such an important position. Considering how he'd won these lands in the first place, that was probably a good call. Cortez would split the rest of his life between New Spain and Old, and he remained a hugely influential figure in both. Mexico City served as a launching pad for future Spanish expansion in the New World. And by the late 18th century, this vast empire covered some 5 million square miles, with most of that territory to be found in North and South America. After the initial outbreak in Tenochtitlan in 1520, smallpox, along with several other Old World exclusives like measles and influenza, would lead to the deaths of a truly staggering number of Native Americans. We're talking many tens of millions here, though the real figures will likely never be known. But just to give you an idea, when Cortez arrived in what we now call Mexico, the native population is thought to have been in the region of 30 million people. Just 50 years later, that number had fallen to just 3 million, with the vast majority of those deaths attributed to Old World infectious diseases. It's easy to think of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs as ancient history, but for many, the wounds left behind are still raw. In 2019, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador wrote a letter to King Felipe VI of Spain demanding a formal apology for the human rights abuses committed by the Spanish against the indigenous peoples of Mexico 500 years ago. Spain refused, claiming that it would be unfair to judge people of past eras to modern standards. Whatever your opinion, there's no denying that the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire was one of the most influential and fascinating events in the history of humankind. And thanks to a series of strange coincidences, a dash of luck, a whole lot of courage, and one hell of a lot of help from his Native American friends, and some diseases, Hernan Cortés dramatically altered the course of human history. Thank you for watching. Keeps is an online subscription service that makes it easy and affordable for men to treat their male pattern baldness. Get expert care for hair loss from the comfort of your home without ever visiting a doctor's office or pharmacy. All treatment plans are personalized to address your unique needs. And the treatment plans are affordable, typically half the cost of traditional pharmacy prices. Keeps offers both of the FDA-approved hair loss treatment options, as well as a 2-in-1 gel that combines both treatments. According to clinical studies, treatments offered by Keeps are 90% effective at treating hair loss and can increase hair growth by up to 35%. Whether you're looking to prevent hair loss, stimulate hair growth, or just take better care of the hair you have, Keeps has you covered. In addition to clinically proven treatments, Keeps offers hair thickening, shampoo, conditioner, and a styling pomade, which I love. Most Keeps customers notice results within 6 months of starting their treatment. To date, Keeps has helped nearly 1 million men to keep their hair. Keeps has over 4,500 5-star reviews. They deliver treatments to your door in discreet packaging, and with shipments every 3, 6, or 12 months, they work to your schedule. Hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get you started, go to keeps.com/42 or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/42. And a big thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video.